So thanks for having us. We have a small group, so interrupt anytime. This works best if it's maximally conversational. My name is Ben Wittes. I'm the editor of Lawfare, and my major role in this project was to convene it. And so I am going to try and talk as little as possible and let these three who played more direct roles in the production of the podcast do as much of the talking as humanly possible. This project grew out of, I'll just say a few words to set up the conversation. This project grew out of a longer-term project that Lawfare has done, which is to try to make narrative podcasts for general interest audiences. We normally work with very specialized audiences in the law and national security space. But we had made a narrative podcast series out of the Mueller report, which had inexplicably done incredibly well, and maybe not so inexplicably, and was actually at one point the #1 podcast on Apple. And so there was so we realized that there was a kind of a market for narrative serial podcasts on lawfare-oriented themes. And one of the things that we were batting around for a while was the Washington Post had done a really incredible series about the run-up to the war in 2022, when it's specifically the U.S. Ukrainian relations aspect of it, where both intelligence services had clearly cooperated a great deal with the Post. And so there was a lot of information suddenly public, and we thought, what could we create a podcast that kind of told that story from both sides' perspectives in a very vivid fashion? This project sat around for a couple of years, or sort of a year and a half. It was daunting, and the person whose idea it was had a baby in the middle of it, and so wasn't in a position to take the lead on it. So I decided to ask somebody else who had just had a baby
in Ukraine.
In Ukraine to take the lead on it. No, so jokes aside, I asked Tyler, who is the managing editor of Lawfare, and Nastia, who was at the time a podcaster with the Kyiv Independent, but more importantly for this purpose, had stayed in our house for a while she was doing some work in Washington a couple of summers ago. And so we had become good friends, and I asked her and Tyler to kind of coordinate this project and to do it, which turned out to be a much more substantial undertaking and kind of migrated away from the original conception, which was very much about the road to war. And the project, as they will describe, actually became much more of a history of U.S. Ukrainian relations from the time of independence, specifically with reference to how to deal with Russia. And, when people tell that story, and one of the critiques that the podcast subtly or not so subtly makes is that, Americans tend to look at Ukraine through Russian eyes. And this was an attempt to look at the Ukrainian-American relationship through American eyes and through Ukrainian eyes, and to look at Russia through Ukrainian eyes rather than the other way around. And so they have spent a year on it, and they've spent, there were a very large number of interviews, which many, but by no means all of which, are reflected in the product. One of them is Eric, who is a longtime Lawfare contributor and friend of the site who works next door at the Carnegie Endowment, and is was a longtime CIA Ukraine Russia hand. So I want to start, Nastya, with the question of the scope and the scope and story that we're trying to tell here. What bounds it? What is inside the story and what is outside the story?
Right. So as Ben has pointed out, we really tried to focus on showing the Ukrainian, Armenian, and American perspectives on the relationship and on Russia. And I would make this joke all the time that Russia was kind of third wheeling this relationship all the time, because we tried to have as little of the Kremlin perspective as possible, and it kept coming up for the sake of the story. But we cover pretty much everything in the relationship from the 90s, when the Soviet Union falls apart, to the present day. And we do it across at least 7 episodes. And since everything that's happening right now is a lot and historical and complicated, we haven't actually written the last episode yet.
The world is still writing it.
Yeah, because it's unfolding in front of our eyes, and it's a question of how we're going to tackle that. Yeah, we start with the fall of the Soviet Union and the infamous Chicken Kyiv speech. Then we go to the Budapest Memorandum. Then we go to Kuchma Gate, and in there, one of those moments when Russia is third wheeling it, the rise of Putin, because we really had to introduce him as a character to make it work. And then from there, we go to the Orange Revolution, and we explain the story of the NATO-Ukrainian relationship, which is one of my favorite episodes in the entire show, and we can talk more about that. And we talk about the Bucharest summit in that episode. From there, which is where we bring Eric on for a remarkable interview, really one of the most interesting things in the podcast, I think. The 5th episode, we do the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Crimea and Donbass, and everything that's happening there, the debate to give or not give Ukraine weapons, which, at times seemed like it actually wasn't much of a debate from the American point of view. And then we go to something that you guys are much more prolific in than I am, the whole impeachment perfect phone call situation, if we can call it that. And then from there, we arrive to the full-scale invasion. So we cover pretty much everything there is in the history. And I think this format of having because this was the idea, to have a Ukrainian host and an American host and kind of have us in conversation with each other. And we also joke that Tyler is playing the role of a naive American who is like, what is Ukraine? Where is it? Which is funny, but also tragic, and very often seems true from a Ukrainian point of view, that's generally how Americans looked at us. And yeah, so it's a really interesting story, and I've learned a great deal.
So Tyler, Nastya alludes to an important theme here, which is a lot of this is history that Ukrainians think they know, and what they actually know is the Ukrainian side of the story.
Yes.
But it's history that Americans don't even think they know, right? And so there's kind of an interest. You ask the average American voter what they think of the Budapest summit, and they'll ask you, is that a Humphrey Bogart movie or something, or the Budapest Memorandum? But if you ask, Ukrainians have opinions about these things,
yes.
And so there's a weird information asymmetry where these are things that are really in the blood of one side, with whatever correct or incorrect perceptions they may have. It's quite a bit of both, actually, but is not at all in the blood of the other. And so Nastya jokes that you play the role of the naive American, and there's some there's some actually good reasons for Americans not to know this history especially well, which is that this is the world from a Ukrainian perspective, and this is one corner of the world from the American perspective. But how do you tell a story in which you are sort of structurally the naive narrator?
I mean, on the one hand, it came naturally. It was an easy task. I don't know a lot about the history, and that's sort of the meta commentary that we're telling here. Is I was born in 1992. I came of age during the War on Terror. I watched the United States focus entirely on the Middle East, and so my attention tracks often U.S. foreign policy's attention. And so a lot of the Ukraine history I didn't know. I kept thinking of during the production of this now sort of infamous scene from the TV show Mad Men, which has become a meme where the two of the characters are in an elevator and one says to the other, "I feel sorry for you." And the other one looks at him and says, "I don't think about you at all," which is kind of a caricature of this dynamic. But there was a bit of that element where something like the Budapest Memorandum, the Bucharest Summit, they were seen as these great betrayals in the eyes of many Ukrainians, and they're just not seen at all in the eyes of many Americans, or they're just footnotes in history. And this led to a lot of tension, a lot of misunderstanding, and we try to tell the story of how these misunderstandings and these disagreements have led us to where we are now. So one example is the Budapest Memorandum that comes up, and even Nastya and I will have disagreements about it, and we're sort of this microcosm of the U.S. Ukraine relationship, where the Budapest Memorandum, it was at a time when Ukraine became independent and inherited a large nuclear arsenal, and the question was whether or not to keep the nuclear arsenal. And so a memorandum was drafted, and the Ukrainian and Russian versions, I believe, had roughly the word guarantee. So it would be a guarantee of U.S. security in exchange for getting rid of the nukes, and there was other economic benefits. And then in the English document, the word was assurance, which is a weaker word. And so it was that likely intentional mistranslation or ambiguous, leaving room for ambiguity. I thought it was kind of a perfect example of this dynamic that keeps coming up.
Yeah, this disagreement, the history of the disagreements and the tensions is fascinating to me, in part because, and this can also be a larger conversation, but of course, the US, let's look at this prior to last fall. The US used to be our most important ally and our biggest supporter, and like the most important country for the sake of surviving against Russia and fighting against Russia. And so to unpack the history with that biggest and most critical ally and see so much disagreement there and so much tension there, it's just very interesting to me. So I loved it.
Yeah,
I loved doing the project.
So one thing that I did not realize when we started this project is how recurrent a certain set of themes are. And broadly speaking, that theme is that the United States goes almost the whole way to giving Ukraine the assurances that it wants, and then pulls back and never quite completes it. And so First President Bush goes to Kyiv, addresses the Ukrainian parliament, and really hedges on Ukrainian independence in a fashion that nobody remembers in the United States, but everybody remembers in Ukraine. The Budapest memo says assurances, but not guarantees. The Bucharest summit is Ukraine is invited to eventually maybe become part of NATO. And then, of course, this culminates last week or 2 weeks ago with the president pulling the rug out from under the president of Ukraine and sort of dressing him down in the Oval Office. And so, Eric, I'm interested in it is tempting to think of what happened between Trump and Zelensky as an enormous betrayal of everything the United States has stood for in this. The mischief maker in me wants to say, hey, it's actually just a dramatic example of the same thing that we've been doing, which is this bait and switch between a triangulation between Ukraine and Russia, in which we provide sort of 90% of the support, but the 10% is really always missing. And so my question to you is, how much should we see current US policy as a radical departure, and how much should we see it as the latest done with Trumpian, flamboyance, iteration of a cycle that has been going on really since the dawn of Ukrainian independence?
I tend to think it's a pretty dramatic departure. In form and in substance. As you guys traced in the podcast, obviously the dynamics between the United States and Russia were very different in the 90s when you had Boris Yeltsin as president, and there was some hope that a democratizing Russia would integrate with the West. And obviously those hopes were a bit naive and misplaced. But, with the exception of that period during which there was still, I would say, substantial concern about the way that Russia was behaving itself in the international sphere and towards its neighbors. The general contours of American foreign policy since the dawn of the Cold War have been to look at Russia with a healthy degree of skepticism and to empathize, at least, rhetorically and diplomatically, with the oppressed peoples around. And I think that's manifested in different policies throughout the decades and the different presidencies, and as there have been different areas of emphasis. But to me, what has happened over the last few weeks is a pretty stark departure from that. And it's not only about building some sort of new transformational partnership between the United States and Russia that would be based on business interests of which no one can really understand what they are, and geopolitical alignment. I mean, this sort of fantasy about cutting the links between Russia and China and getting Russia on our side against China. Again, all of that is really pretty fantastical. But then I think throwing the Ukrainians under the bus in a way that, no one has done before. I think that's different than the sort of 80 to 90% solutions that you guys uncovered in the podcast, where I think there was a genuine understanding by policymakers and presidents of both parties that there is an American interest in, on the macro level, a Europe whole free net peace, the Ukraine recognition that the Ukrainians want to be, with Europe and integrating with Europe. Again, there's been a little back and forth in Ukrainian politics over the years about the orientation to Europe vis-a-vis Russia, but a general acceptance that the Ukrainians did not want to certainly be back under Moscow's thumb. And yet this sort of hesitation to fully embrace Ukraine, I think at the start because of significant governance challenges, but then also this looming question about how far can you push American power into Europe before you confront the very real challenges of Russian pushback. And so one can make an argument that, the sort of half measures along the way were a good faith effort to, support Ukraine's quest for a more democratic European future while avoiding the worst case outcome that we're now in, which is full-scale war with Russia. And obviously it didn't work. So you have to go back and question the fundamental logic of whether the half measures made sense and whether it would have been better to just sort of take the model we took towards Poland, which was, you want to be in the family, you're in the family. But of course, that decision was made under very different political circumstances. Poland was in a completely different place when it joined NATO than Ukraine was at that time. The role of Polish Americans in kind of American political dynamics. And then again, it was done at a time when Russia was a basket case and was very weak. And so we could make these security guarantees and write a check that we never thought we would ever have to cash. And they ended up under the umbrella, and Ukraine didn't. And it's a tragedy when you think about it, but also when you put yourself back in the shoes of people like, you interviewed, Steve Piper and all of those. The idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO at that time in the 90s was still pretty far off. And even in Ukrainian thinking, it was like not really what Ukraine was looking for. So it's hindsight is 2020, and it's easy to go back and say we've been weak, we've betrayed, and all of that. But when you look at what American policymakers were trying to deal with in the world they were living in at that time, you can sort of understand it. And I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were trying to do what they thought was best in this overall goal of integrating Ukraine into the West. But maybe they just didn't choose the right tools at the right time.
All right, so I'm going to now take a fallback position, which fortunately is to what I actually believe. This one I'm not advancing in my role as a mischief maker, but this more sincerely, that there is a through line of continuity between the the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration. Certain things aside, the first Trump administration and the Biden administration in this. I'm sorry, I forgot Barack Obama. 8 years, you're like that.
Yeah.
And the finally Biden administration, and what really fits into this pattern of the 85–90%, but the missing 5% is the first 3 years of the war, where the Biden administration gives just an enormous amount of military aid, but puts a lot of constraints on it. But, there are sharp disagreements between the Ukrainians and the Americans about what can be used for what, and this weapon system, but not that weapon system. And so, and I think even the small matter that led to his impeachment aside, even the first Trump administration was not a radical break from the pattern of that support, but not enough support from a Ukrainian perspective. I'm curious, so do you agree with me that US policy is, in the main, relatively consistent from 1990 until 6 weeks ago?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the strategic objectives were pretty much the same all along, which was supporting an independent, sovereign, democratic Ukraine. I mean, that's the overall objective. How we do it based on what's going on, I mean, it varies from president to president, but that was always the objective. And I mean, I guess I think it's still there to a certain extent, but almost just by default.
Right. Because those switches haven't been turned off yet.
Yeah. And because fundamentally, due to Ukrainians' willingness and capability with a lot of Western support to resist Russia's attack, Ukrainian independence still stands. And so it's almost as if Trump has to deal with it as a fact of life. Ukraine is still independent, so you can't force a complete capitulation in these talks that are going on. And again, we're sitting here and there's Putin's making statements and things are happening in real time. This is extremely dynamic. But I don't think that the commitment to that strategic objective is there from this administration in the way that it's been.
All right, let's talk about storytelling. So there are many, many ways to tell this story. You guys chose, I think, perhaps the hardest, which is, or maybe I chose perhaps the hardest, which is, first of all, to do it orally. Secondly, to do it in relatively short episodes. And the third is to do it in, you could have done a 20-hour documentary on this subject and not run out of tape. And the third element is to do it in a fashion that relatively large numbers of people, rather than very niche audiences, are going to want to listen to. And so Nastia first, and then Tyler, talk to us about the challenges of telling this story in that format? Because it's not, like a dissertation, right?
It's very hard. Yeah.
I'm gonna get some water.
This was probably like the biggest challenge for me, to be honest, and the biggest, like the single biggest source of tension in the team between me and
Creative tension.
creative tension. Yes, it didn't feel like that at the time, but the amount of angry discussions I had with my colleagues, just because, like the hardest thing for me was the fact that you can't tell the entirety of Ukrainian history in like one act of a 3-act one episode kind of thing. And of course, as a Ukrainian, that was my mission with the project, that I need to inform the Americans and the broader Western audience about Ukrainian history and the Ukrainian perspective, because that is my role. And so a part of it was just because I've never worked on a narrative podcast before. I've done other podcasts, but they weren't like scripted narrative projects. And so I didn't really know what I was doing at first. But so now when I look back at, the 10 pages of Ukrainian and repressions of Bolsheviks and, that I would write in, and my colleagues would be like, we can't, like, Americans are not going to listen to 15 minutes of Holodomor. Like, you can't do that. And so, of course, I was mad, and, that you're doing what you're always doing. You're ignoring our history. Like, you can't tell me what to do and stuff. But no, I think
Playing my part.
yeah, no, I think the way that so this, like, the subtracting the most important parts and highlighting them, and telling a captivating story in a way that people who have no idea what we're talking about will actually listen to and not turn it off because it's boring. It's a very, very challenging job. Like, it's a lot harder than it sounds.
And what's the absolute key to it? The thing that, like, I'm gonna sing the praises of our producer Max, who's not here, but
Yeah, he's
but
yeah.
who was, I think it's fair to say, your principal opponent in a lot of these disputes.
Right. Well, yeah. So Max, who's not here, but we're gonna talk
And
to him.
if Max were here, what he would say is the absolute secret to this is building each episode around a person, right?
Or a place.
Or a place
Yeah.
or somebody, but
Right.
somebody's
Yeah.
each one of these one acts has a character.
Yeah.
Has a it can be a little vignette. So I'm gonna throw some names at you guys. And tell us, like, some of them are gonna be names that you guys know, and some of them are names that you will have never heard of before and will never hear of again. And just tell us a little bit about who these people are in the story. So let's first talk about Fiona Hill, who, of course, you all remember from the first impeachment. She's a dear colleague of mine at Brookings, but she plays a very, like, a much more general role in this story. So Tyler, who is Fiona for purposes of this story?
Well, I feel like you have a much stronger relationship with her now after, so I may let you take this one, if that's okay. And then maybe I'll talk about Sarah Sievers after.
Please,
Okay.
yeah.
Sure. But, well, Fiona is amazing because when we did the interview with her, which was, I think, several hours long, we then used her tape for like several episodes because she seemed to just be everywhere.
She's the Forrest Gump of this story. She's everywhere.
Like, whatever important episode of the relationship there was, she seemed to be there, and she seemed to have these incredible insights. And so she is an amazing narrator because she's always there. She's often not in the room where decisions are made, but she is in the room with the president and briefing him before the decisions are made. So it was just really amazing.
And not just Trump in the impeachment context.
Yeah, I didn't even realize, how important she was for that.
Yeah, no, but like, that's why she's a household name.
We didn't even talk to her about that. We talked about like the 90s and the 2000s, and she had like that was the meat of that interview. And she carries several episodes through, and it's really amazing. And one of the best quotes from her, I think. Well, one, she's present in my favorite episode, which is the Bucharest Summit episode, which we can talk about. I think it's very interesting. And then one of the best quotes from her is she says that after the Soviet Union falls apart, there wasn't really an appreciation on the American side that this is a place with very rich history, and that communism wasn't the only problem. And she explains how Americans thought that if communism is gone, then, you know, the place is going to transform and be this democratic haven. And meanwhile, Ukrainians are like, wait a second, like, not really. And that there were much deeper problems of imperialism, you know, just under different flags at different times. And so she really talks about that. And I love that it's an American making that point, that I don't have to find a Ukrainian to make that point. So I loved her interview.
So Sarah Sievers, some of you may know because she's local. She was, among other things, my sister's Harvard roommate, which is how I know her. But that was before any of the events that take place in this. So who is Sarah Sievers?
But not long before.
Not long before.
So Sarah Sievers comes in early in the season during the Budapest memorandum. Sarah is such a great character because she goes to Ukraine as a very young foreign service officer with the State Department. I believe it's her first post. She's also just
and by the way, not in the podcast, but while she was waiting for her security clearance, she and I worked together for my mom.
It's a family affair.
It's like, you know, I remember like going to work every day with Sarah, and she's, you know, getting a security clearance can take a long time, and she and I were setting up my mother's company.
Sounds like you look around and grab whoever's closest. Nastia was staying in your house.
I mean, if you guys were doing this, I happen to know someone who got set up Embassy Kiev and ended up working on the Budapest memo.
But like I was saying, Sarah's such a great character because she recounts her experience through the exciting young perspective that she had at the time. And she also was just had such a colorful way of talking. When we sat down, the first thing we asked was, can you tell us about the first time you went to Kyiv? And we expected her to say, I arrived at the embassy in early 90s.
Yeah.
And she's like, actually, no, I was there a couple of years before with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, if you can believe it. And we're like, all right, this is already great. But she really paints the scene. I mean, she remembers so much, I think, because it was an early formative experience where people were talking about loose nukes, and you can go to this bar if you want information on where to find one. And the other thing that she brings to the story is this deep emotion of she feels a lot of guilt about the Budapest memorandum and her role in it. I think she's being too hard on herself, but she really means it. She sees it as a betrayal, and she sees I think some degree of complicity in that betrayal.
So one person who does not feel guilt, and I think the only person we talk to who's kind of unrepentant about the Budapest memo. People have different senses of what the problem is, but is Steve Pfeiffer, who you mentioned before. He was the third ambassador to Ukraine, and he was also the person who saw the word guarantees in the draft, and I believe he's quoted in the thing as saying, this is an absolute non-starter for us, and forced it to come out. And his description, which I found very striking, was, hey, I look back on this as an American diplomat and I say, we got 1,900 nukes pointed at the United States, just decommissioned and destroyed. And I am apologizing to nobody for that. We weren't, and by the way, we've lived up to the Budapest memo, because what the Budapest memo said was, we would take an interest if anything happened to Ukrainian borders. We would do something about it, but we're not going to send the 82nd Airborne. And that's more or less what we've done. So I want to ask you, Nastia, how do you feel when you had that conversation? Like, what was it like to confront somebody who actually says, A, I'm not sorry about the Budapest memorandum, and B, we've honored it. In fact, we haven't betrayed anybody.
Right.
And so you address that. And then Eric, I want to ask you, is Steve right from an American? Because I don't think it's an obvious question. That kind of what he said was, unless you're prepared to send the Marines, you should not use the word guarantees. You should use something softer. And what that something softer says is it's not going to be something that we're not going to care about. We may send $180 billion, but we're not going to use the word guarantees when we don't mean it. We clearly didn't mean it. And therefore, the Budapest memo was just a reflection of the degree of commitment that we had. So my question, so that's the sequence. I'm going to shut up and let you guys take it.
To be fair to Ambassador Pfeiffer, he has since when Russia first invaded Ukraine been a great advocate for increased support for Ukraine. And so he's a big friend of Ukraine, of course. But that interview was an interesting interview. Not only because we talked about this linguistic thing that happened, which, by the way, everyone in the room was aware of and Ukrainians were aware of. And so it's an important point to make that everyone knew what was happening and that they were signing essentially two different documents.
And that one was the authoritative text and the other was an intentional mistranslation of it.
Exactly.
What's the language of record?
English. So, I mean, it's, sorry?
Sorry to jump in. I'm just wondering, like, why would everybody have just knowingly gone ahead with that and not tried to get the same version for both sides? That just doesn't strike me as.
Because there were domestic audiences involved. So America couldn't afford to provide a NATO-like guarantee to Ukraine. Like it was just a non-starter for them. But Ukrainian diplomats had to show up to the Ukrainian parliament and be like, hey, we negotiated something strong here. So
there were even stories Steve has told. I don't know if he told it in this podcast, but it's in his sort of Brookings recounting where the Ukrainian side really wanted it printed on treaty paper, like in large treaty paper. And as they were trying to print it, like the paper was jamming in the printer and all of that. But again, it was a bit absurd. It was a bit absurd, but the sensitivity of giving up the nuclear inheritance was so strong that, the foreign ministry and, Presidents Kravchuk and Kuchma felt that they really needed to show that this was a bigger thing than just paper assurances.
I'll also add really quickly, there were other factors involved as well. We spoke with Ukrainian diplomat Boris Tarasyuk. I think I was going to say the other tension is that I always butcher the Ukrainian pronunciation. So maybe that's
sure really everything in Russian and Ukrainian.
But he was telling us, he was there at the time as well, and he was saying that Ukraine never really could keep the nuclear arsenal because it was expensive to maintain. The command and control structure was actually in Moscow, and there were just incentives, other incentives. So that also may have made it more acceptable on the Ukrainian side.
It was very complicated, but as you said, that Ukrainians just really had to show to the people and the parliament that, like, look, we've achieved something very grand here. And they talk about it like that to this day. Zelensky and people around him talk about, a treaty that America broke or didn't honor, which if you look at history, isn't really what happened. But
something.
Yeah.
The commanding control of the nukes was in Russia.
Yeah.
Right. So what exactly do we mean when we say that the Ukrainians had the nuclear weapons? I mean, I understand that they were there physically, but if it's Russia that's still controlling them.
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and it's something that a lot of Ukrainians allied because the weapons were completely useless to Ukraine. The only value of those weapons is that the United States wanted them destroyed.
Well, Ukrainians actually would disagree with you on this a little bit.
What would they say?
Well, so some people, and I see people arguing about this right now to this day, that, it's not like we didn't have the engineers and the scientists who could make it work. Like if we really wanted to, we could somehow spend a bunch of money and
a bunch of money that Ukraine in the
didn't
have.
Yeah, so
they didn't have the ability to make them not.
Yes.
Which is not insignificant, right?
Well, we were given a bunch of money to destroy them.
There was no discussion at the time of Ukraine keeping the weapons and making them operative under Ukrainian control. I mean, that's something that people sometimes talk about in retrospect, but it was not politically on the table.
it was
not mainstream.
It was not, yeah, like I
There
think
was a
it was
discussion.
present. It was
There a
present.
discussion. I would recommend,
Yes.
for those really interested in this
Mariana
topic,
Buderin's book,
reading Mariana Buderin's
100%.
Inheriting the Bomb.
Yeah.
She's at the Belfer Center, and that's, to me, that's the authoritative
Yes.
text.
And she's in the podcast.
Yeah, that's based on,
Yeah.
American archives, Ukrainian archives, Russian archives.
Yeah.
And explains, what would have been technologically possible, and that there was, some part of the newly formed Ukrainian military that was advocating at least exploring the option of whether
Yes.
something beyond administrative control could be taken, as a bargaining chip.
Mhm.
But as she also explains in
Yes.
your podcast, the shadow of Chernobyl looms so large over Ukrainian politics that Ukrainians across the political spectrum fundamentally wanted to be a non-nuclear nation. And
Mhm.
so going back to Ben's point, it was pretty taboo, the idea of taking control of the weapons,
Mhm.
truly.
Mhm. But there was some minor discussions. There
Yeah.
were these like working papers of the parliament that they
Yeah.
would commission from these work groups being like, okay, lay down the pros and cons of keeping them, of destroying them, getting rid of them. So there was some discussion, but mainstream, it was pretty clear that there was no real way. I mean, we would have made an enemy of the United States right at a point when we just became independent. Like,
Right.
so anyway, really people should read Mariana's book on this. But
And that was called Inheriting the Bomb.
Inheriting the
Bomb.
Bomb, yes.
Yeah.
Going back to your question, how it made me feel, because that's really important for the
That's-
podcast.
yeah.
That's really what this whole thing is about. But that question actually made me think of another interview that we had, which was an interview with Michael McFaul, because that interview was really a big example for me of this dilemma that Ukrainians have when they look at this history, because I was expecting to have a very, as you guys know, a very heated interview, because Michael McFaul has a long.
This is former U.S. ambassador to
Yes.
Moscow and
Yes.
NSC staffer in the Obama administration.
Right. And he's worked in Russia for decades, and he has a lot of friends in Russia. He's done a lot of great work in Russia. And I've always thought of him as like someone who really loves Russia, loves Russian culture, and he believed in the possibility of democratizing Russia and things like that. So a lot of the things that are now kind of taboo in Ukraine to think about or talk about. So I thought that it's going to be a very heated interview, and I was already preparing to get mad, but we actually had a lovely interview. The first thing he said, like the opening of his answer when we talked about the reset policy under Obama, he said that the reset was about American national security interests. I repeat, American national security interests, like, and I'm quoting him right now. So he really nailed it down. And to me, that episode that we did, the episode around 9/11, the one about Kuchma-Gate and the rise of Putin, that really highlighted to me this kind of like very basic point. This is like politics 101, that every country has its own
Yes.
national security interests. I know you'll love when I say that. But like this is something that Ukrainians, amidst the full-scale invasion, amidst an ongoing genocide from the Ukrainian point of view, this is not something that we are going to think about. Like we think about our survival. But then when you look at history, you see that, well, America had 9/11, America had troops in Afghanistan, America had like this whole list of things that it wanted to achieve, talks with Iran. And so when you look at that, I remember you said that Ukraine at points wasn't even in the top 10 of priorities of everything that America was dealing with. And it's a very hard pill to swallow for Ukrainians, but it's just a fact, right? It's a matter of reality. And so it's hard for me to sit through those interviews, but it's also like a very important reminder that like the world works not just around Ukraine.
Mhm.
Ukraine is not the global hegemon of the international politics. America is, and America has its own national security interests.
I will say
Sorry, this is a long rant.
it was fun for me watching Michael McFaul immediately disarm Nastia by coming out and saying, no, it was a big mistake. We really messed up. And he did it
Yes.
so nicely. And it was fun watching it
Yeah.
happen in real time when Nastia was.
I was like ready to attack, and then he was like, no, we completely failed to deter Moscow. And I'm like, okay, wow.
So I want to go back to Pfeiffer, because I look at the Budapest memo in retrospect, and I kind of react similarly to him, in that I look at it and I say it was an honest reflection of what we were and weren't prepared to do. And it in fact reflects what we did do. And the problem lies in the fact that people assumed it meant more than it did. And I guess I'm curious for your sense in retrospect of whether the Budapest Memorandum was a mistake or whether Ukrainian investment in it was the mistake.
Or lack thereof.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the Budapest memo and I say, it says, Pfeiffer's description of it is not inaccurate in terms of what we are and aren't prepared to do.
This is the thing, if you think about an alternate world where it was the strongest possible document ratified, but a treaty ratified by the Senate, it said, we will come to Ukraine's defense in case it is attacked, something that made it look exactly like NATO. The counter argument is, well, so what? What would it have meant if it was just on paper? And if you compare it to something like NATO and the Washington Treaty and Article 5, the text of Article 5 is, somewhat ambiguous.
Right, but what's not ambiguous is a large number of U.S. troops.
Right, what's not ambiguous is what NATO means and what NATO has come to mean over 70 years of an alliance. And so it's not just a paper document that underpins, it's exercises, it's joint planning, it's political consultations, it's all these summits every year.
The rhetoric.
It's a bureaucracy around it. I mean, the allies with US leadership have built NATO into an effective deterrent against Russian aggression. And that's why this war has not expanded outside of Ukrainian territory to a large extent, because Russia, it doesn't want to challenge NATO. But even if you had had the strongest possible document and Ukrainian diplomats got everything that they wanted in the Budapest, let's call it Treaty on Security Guarantees, if there was no follow-up, it wouldn't have meant anything. And I think, Mariana makes this point in her book, and I agree with her thesis that basically the Budapest Memorandum was not the problem in and of itself. It was the total failure of both sides to follow up on it. So Ukraine, for years, underinvested in its conventional military, and it let its army dwindle. It kind of lost this sense of, national security and strategic culture. Again, we have to be clear, there was significant corruption, political corruption and economic mismanagement in Ukraine throughout the 90s and much of the 2000s.
And there was an intra-Ukrainian vacillation reflected
Between
in both
Russia
Kuchma and particularly Yanukovych,
right,
where Ukraine did its own flirtations with Moscow.
and even Kuchma himself. Yeah,
We're going to come to that.
even Kuchma himself, changed over time. And but again, point being, in an alternate universe, Ukraine could have said, okay, we have this memorandum. Now we need to really intensively invest in our own military in the way one could say that Finland did after the Winter War and after the very unfair treaty that they were forced to sign with the Soviet Union, ceding a significant part of their territory and becoming de facto neutral, sharing an enormous border with the Soviet Union. But they didn't say, oh, well, we've got sort of this relationship with Sweden and sort of an understanding with Europe, because there wasn't really. And so they said, we need to invest in our military. We need to have universal conscription and military service and this huge reserve. And we need to train people to, fire weapons on skis and defend the border. And we need to have a defense industrial base and all of that. And Ukraine, on the other hand, just let it all atrophy. On the other side, Americans lost focus. And I think that's the big strategic error. And I think Steve would probably agree with that. The memorandum itself, it could have been a framework for a broader strategic partnership between the United States and Ukraine on security. And I think a lot of people in, the Clinton administration sort of saw it as a done deal. And then the main objective was getting the nukes out. And then it's like, problem solved, on to the next thing. Instead of, okay, this is a really good starting point to reframe the relationship. And now we need to really partner with Ukraine outside of NATO right? Because Ukraine was in the Partnership for Peace and all of that, but was not seeking NATO membership throughout the 90s and most of the early 2000s. But we need to ensure an effective Ukrainian conventional deterrent, because otherwise you leave a large part of Europe vulnerable if there is a change in Russian thinking, which people were entertaining at that time. And so instead, both sides just sort of, threw up their hands and kind of hoped for the best and pretended that there wasn't going to be this perennial issue. So that's where I would say the mistakes were made. It's not the document in and of itself, it's what came afterwards.
Yeah, I think I think I really agree with that. So I want to ask you both, start with you, Tyler, because you're closer. We came to this very self-consciously as let's have an American co-host and let's have a Ukrainian co-host and let's have them explore these episodes together from both perspectives. And so Nastia said before, this part, meaning Yanukovych, is awkward for me. So I'm interested from hearing from you both, what are the parts that you look back and say, we, meaning whatever country you're from, really screwed this part up, and this is the part of the story that is on us.
Yeah, well, first I'll say, one thing I say in the first episode is that I do have a tangential Ukrainian connection, which is that my great-grandparents were born there, but they're Jews and they came to the US and they've never really claimed that identity for many, many reasons, which probably a lot of you know. But I've also found myself to almost flip your question on its head. I found myself in an unfamiliar position quite a few times during this podcast of actually defending US foreign policy choices, which I often find myself in the opposite position. In the Budapest memo, the one where I see where we were coming from. But many more times throughout the episodes was very awkward for me. This sort of 90% the way there, leaving the 10% ambiguous or open, only for Russia to exploit, kept coming up again and again. And it was mostly awkward because the stakes in this history and this present day reality are so different for me and Nastia. And it was, Nastia's here now, but we only met in person for the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
after a year of Zoom-based reporting and messages from Nastia about going into a bomb shelter or being under and hearing drones and things like that. And it was just a constant reminder that sure, I can understand where the US is coming from, but just again, the stakes are just so different. And it was very it was an important perspective, but very humbling that it's just we're just approaching this so differently.
I remember when we were writing the episode, the part about Putin's rise and American reaction to that, and the whole I saw his soul and that whole whatever that was. I remember
Look in his eyes, Nastia. I don't know which part of that you understand.
So I remember I was researching the Putin's background and what was happening in Russia at that time, and there's this myth that Putin came out of nowhere and he was a nobody and that he wasn't remarkable in any way, and I was like looking into whether that was true at all, and I remember I was texting actually you, Ben, and probably you, Teller, too, about how is it possible that Americans were so seemed, in retrospect, so naive about the fact that this could be a great, prosperous, democratic country, when if you look at what was happening, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, where Putin worked before he became prime minister and climbed up the ladder. When you look at, the apartment bombings, which we uncovered, when you look at, but not even the apartment bombings, because I guess some can say that that's conspiracy, but when you look at all of that, how can you really not see that the country is run by bandits? And then you were like, well, look at all the other Soviet, post-Soviet countries. I think you were like, look at those other places where Americans just Americans thought that was just part of the game, part of the transition. Nobody really cared.
It was calm compared to Tajikistan.
Yeah, I think that's what was said.
Or or
Yeah.
Turkmenistan. I mean, at least they weren't building, making everybody read his book and building statues to him, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there-
And so it's again this like different perspective on things.
and also if you compare like to like, and you say, your reaction when you started reading about Kuchma is, wow, this looks really Russian,
Yeah,
and
it's really bad.
that's contemporaneous with the
Mhm.
period in which,
Yeah.
so, we're looking at the Soviet Union falls apart and every single one of these countries except the Baltics are total messes right away. And we're dealing with what we've got
Mhm.
and next to Zelensky, Yeltsin looks really bad, but does he look really bad compared to Kuchma? Well, looks pretty bad, a little bit bad compared to Kuchma, but they're a lot closer.
I wish you didn't raise the Zelensky issue because we're gonna have opinions. But anyway, yeah, I think that's very interesting. Just the fact that even within our group, we looked at things kind of from very different perspectives.
I think there's also a difference, honestly, between people whose fundamental understandings of Ukraine are formed post-Euromaidan or during Euromaidan and everybody else.
It's a rock in my garden. I got
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I mean, I think when I remember being very surprised by the Euromaidan,
Mhm.
and before it, even though the Orange Revolution had happened not that long ago, right?
Yeah.
Just because I had this very 90s sense of Ukraine as a governance mess.
Yeah.
And so it's like all of a sudden there's great political movements happening in Argentina that surprises you because you have certain expectations of Argentinian politics. And the 90s, I just went to a wedding in Argentina, so Argentinian matters are on my mind. But
But see what all I remember about Ukraine is post Euromaidan.
exactly,
Because I'm so young.
and if you look at Ukrainian politics in the post-Euromaidan period, they're extremely attractive.
Yeah.
Particularly compared to ours.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about, and again, you guys should jump
Yeah, we
in
should open it
anytime. Let's talk about the part of the story that is not written yet. And one of the things we have not done anything on is the war, except the part of the war that started in 2014. And we haven't done anything on the radical change in US politics that is happening. And we sort of made a decision to wait as long as we can to write that on the theory that if we ever reach a stable equilibrium, it will be not soon, right? And so the longer we can put off writing that, the more we are in a position to capture what becomes a later stage of the development. As Nastia might say, this is an awkward moment to
say the least.
To have.
I will say there's one exception to that, which is the Ukrainian cultural forces. So in episode 6, I believe, we do bring in some more recent reporting, and this is an episode we recorded a lot of it in September when Max and I, so Nastia was still in Ukraine. Max and I followed around a group called the Ukrainian Cultural Forces, which are a group of musicians, essentially an outfit of the military, who were on tour in the United States to help.
They're all wounded musicians.
Yeah, and extremely talented, and they wear, some of them wear their wounds. I mean, one person has an eye patch, and so we followed them for a few events, one of which was a meeting on Capitol Hill, ostensibly a meeting on Capitol Hill with a large group of Republican members of Congress. And so we thought this would be such great tape. This will be great to see them in action and see Republican
And you said that they
reactions.
were very excited about it.
They're
right?
very
They were
excited.
looking
Yeah.
forward
Yeah.
to
This
it.
is kind of I think the centerpiece of the entire trip. They built this tour around it. And so Max and I, the producer, we show up on Capitol Hill. We follow them around. We're helping carrying their instruments, and we get to the room where it's supposed to happen. There's a few aides milling about, and there's one single congressman. I think it was Steve Cohen of Tennessee, a Democrat, and I think
No Republicans.
and no
Yeah.
Republicans, and it was extremely. It was sad. I mean, it was hard to watch and to see the disappointment, but it was also a complete canary in the coal mine of things to come, and just a total encapsulation of this emerging dynamic among the Republican Party and its views on Ukraine and vis-a-vis Trump.
Yeah.
And so we paired that with the episode with the impeachment and the perfect phone call. But that was the one element that we did stick in that's more recent.
Right. You are absolutely correct. But I mean, we have not yet written the episode that covers the U.S. Ukrainian interactions
Yeah.
about the war itself.
We should ask Eric about that because him and I have had so many discussions about this and exchanges.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I loved that you framed several of these questions around like whether it's just a continuation of a bad dynamic or a radical shift. This is something I was actually asked a few weeks ago, and I said that, and this was before Americans like cut aid and cut intelligence sharing, which they since, thank God, restored. But I said that Ukrainians don't see this as a radical shift. Ukrainians really, and this apparently comes as a surprise to many Americans, Ukrainians really thought that the Biden White House did a terrible job managing the situation. And people really, like in Ukraine, people, just average Ukrainians, really hate Jake Sullivan because for some reason they think that he's how America has a border czar. They thought that Jake Sullivan is the war czar and he made all the decisions. Did you?
Yeah, he's progressive here next month.
Yeah.
He knows he's not liked in Ukraine.
Yeah. So Ukrainians really think that the whole escalation management and just like dripping the aid little by little by little and the whole boiling the frog thing is just a failure. And so therefore, I think many Ukrainians believe that this is like much, much worse, but it's not like a 180 from good to bad. It's from bad to worse. So I wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I have a fundamentally different view of that.
But we don't even have to talk about Trump. I think what's interesting here is to talk about the disagreements that the US and Ukraine had during the full-scale invasion before Trump.
For sure. No, I mean, one could actually make an argument that the most radical departure of all in US-Ukraine relations was under Biden during the full-scale invasion, because we had to choose a side and we chose Ukraine's side, and we did things that were preposterous prior to the invasion.
Okay.
Arming
wait,
Ukraine
wait.
with tens of billions of dollars worth of heavy weapons to kill Russians. Like, if you had asked anyone about that before February 22, they would have, like, their heads would have exploded.
Yeah, so I want to pause you right there because just to dwell on the disparity between the things that the two of you just said, both of which I want to validate are true. There is no doubt that there is a great deal of frustration in Ukraine, including at the presidential level.
Yes.
With Joe Biden and all his works. There is similarly no doubt that there was an enormous, from my point of view, very weird degree of what Nastia sometimes calls Trump optimism in Ukrainian government circles. And it is similarly true, as Eric says, that the degree to which American policymakers moved mountains, to some of which story has never been told, down to finding boxes of, this munition in warehouses in this, hidden place. I mean, the actual logistics of getting weapons to Ukraine was something that a huge number of people spent an enormous amount of time, energy, and both in the Pentagon and in the intelligence community. And so I want to kind of explore that disparity that, on the one hand, the Biden administration actually did an enormous amount to the level of head exploding. And on the other hand, both domestically and in Ukraine, its response is understood as weak. And so, first of all, Eric, I want to ask you, explain the disparity. And then Nastya, I want to ask you, what is the explanation for Ukrainian lack of understanding of how many mountains were moved?
I think, the Biden administration, what it got wrong, number one was communicating its strategy, which I think it was terrible at doing. It was very good at managing crisis and, sort of working the bureaucracy behind the scenes to move an enormous amount of weapons from places, far around the world into Ukraine, which is itself like a book length, story waiting to be told how that was done. But it was terrible at communicating what it was going to do. And I think it lacked a sort of strategic vision about maybe how to boil the frog. And I guess one can argue that the boiling the frog strategy, this incremental escalation of U.S. support, I think Ukrainians would say that was the wrong idea, overly kind of cautious vis-a-vis Russia and so on and so forth. As an American, I think it makes a lot of sense because you fundamentally don't understand the other side. It's very opaque in Moscow, and you don't want to trigger World War III. And there was a non-trivial chance that World War III would be triggered in this confrontation. I mean, we've never been in this kind of war with Russia, even arming the Mujahideen again. This is orders of magnitude bigger than that. And so I think Biden and others around him were right to be a little concerned about the escalatory dynamics. I think, you can say, again, in retrospect, decisions should have been made faster, and they should have had a sense that as this war dragged on, more could be done faster and in a bit of a more coherent fashion. And I think ultimately, you get to the point of providing tanks and F-16s and long-range weapons and all of that. I think that should have happened sooner, and it should have been clearer that it could have happened sooner. But the overall framework of not doing everything up front and sort of testing the other side's red lines, to me, is a pretty logical and responsible policy as an American. And again, I do think that, at every decision point, pretty much, the Biden administration chose to support and increase its support for Ukraine and led what was initially a very reluctant Europe. Now, Europe has become the greater cheerleader for Ukraine, but that was not the case at first.
Right.
And when we look prior to the invasion, no one believed us when Biden and Jake Sullivan and others were going around saying there's going to be this invasion. Zelensky, by the way, didn't believe. Many Ukrainians didn't believe because it was such a crazy idea that Russia would just launch this massive invasion completely unprovoked. And so, sure, we can say America didn't do enough to deter all of that, but fundamentally, if nobody believed this invasion was going to happen, what more was there to do? And there was pre-positioning and there was planning and all of that. Again, I think my criticisms would be more around the margins of the timeline of decisions and things like that. But I think the substance of it made a lot of sense. And I can't imagine an alternative reality and what that would even look like to have done more. Fundamentally, because I don't think that the United States was ever going to send troops once the war started.
So channel your inner median Ukrainian.
Right.
And
I'm gonna back up.
You clearly worked with me. You know what I can do when I'm mad. Well, yeah. So Ukrainians would like obviously disagree with all of that, which I know you know well, because well, one again, any Ukrainian would say that that's as always caring more about Russia than what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and what Ukraine needs to win. And so one of the biggest frustrations has always been with this, you know, we'll stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. And Simon Schuster really nicely put it in his article for Time, I think a few months ago. He was like, as long as it takes to do what? And so
Yeah, it's terrible messaging.
yeah,
That's
okay.
my point.
Right.
Very bad PR.
Yeah, and so, exactly. And so it's the same thing with like the Bucharest summit when they said, you know, the policy of open doors and, you know, Ukraine will one day become a member of NATO. We actually like believe in that stuff and we want that and we believe Americans when they say that. And then, you know, like decades go by and we're like, hi, like, you know, how long, like, what else do we have to do? How long do we have to wait? But on the boiling the frog thing, I mean, pretty much universally, I think Ukrainian military analysts, and this is not just like random Ukrainians, like military analysts who study this, I think they agree that America has a lot more resources that it could have allocated to us, because a lot of this is a question of political will, right? And someone you know who you introduced to me a few weeks ago, I was talking to this person in Washington about this. He's a journalist, and he said that like he agreed with me, even though he's an American. I was really glad that he agreed with me. He said that he too thought that the Biden administration was slow because maybe a bad comparison, but he said, you know, when Trump wants something done, people do it, even if they have to like bend the law and skip procedure and don't do the proper checks. But every administration kind of has a personality based on the president, right? So Biden loves procedure, Biden loves process. He needs to go through all of the proper, you know, planning and management or whatever. And so he like his personality is like that. When Trump wants something to happen, everyone knows that they will, you know, lose their careers and livelihoods unless they make it happen. So to the point that if Biden really wanted to do something much faster, he could have. It was a deliberate choice, the strategic choice to be slow. And to Ukrainians, of course, when you hear Americans say, you know, at one point, when we ask for a certain weapon system, American generals go in the air and they say, we don't think Ukraine needs it. They would literally say, we don't think Ukraine needs it because it's not going to work. And then we ask for a year, and a year they give it to us. And it actually is amazing, and it does work.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Not all the time. I agree.
I mean, I will say again, there is a misunderstanding, a lot of misunderstandings about kind of the American stockpile and that we have this vast, limitless resource of like amazing weapons that we're just holding for ourselves. You know, what the Biden administration had to do, and it was done in a very bureaucratic and procedurally focused manner, like Nastya was saying, was essentially force the different military services to give up stuff that they owned. And getting to a point where you force the US military to take on risk in other parts of the world in order to support Ukraine.
So part of the problem is that Ukrainians never think or hear about that. I think that's a part of the problem. No, because why would they?
And the US doesn't want to be making that the main talking point. Like, okay, we're actually we're more vulnerable in Asia. Like, FYI. That's not going to be the main talking point. But you know, that is a reality, and a reality of like the ATACMS weapons. We don't have like tens of thousands of these. It was a very small stockpile, for example. And then again, on the kind of weapons, and I'm just, you know, I'm giving the perspective of, you know, someone who sat in a policy chair and you're kind of trying to make these decisions. So for example, the first congressional aid package was something like $40 billion. Ukraine wanted F-16s like immediately, right, in March 2022. A package for F-16s, first of all, you need to train people, which takes quite a long time. Now, they should have started training early on, but they didn't. But again, the training, the maintenance, all of that, the number of airframes that they would get would eat up a huge amount of that $40 billion. And instead, at that point, this was becoming an artillery duel. And what the United States said was, actually, you need artillery munitions. And so we're going to scale up artillery production. We're going to try to surge you all this, we're going to give you HIMARS, which were great on the battlefield. But it was, again, a push and pull between Ukrainian military leaders who thought they needed one thing, Americans who said, we don't think you need that. I think there was right and wrong on both sides.
I agree with that.
And I think you saw the display of the failure of communication in the 23 counteroffensive,
Yes.
where, Ukraine had a concept, then U.S. European Command had a concept, and they never sort of gelled together. And if you ask American policymakers what went wrong there, they really do think we surged as much as we could reasonably pull from the shelves at that point to put Ukraine in the best possible position. And then the concept itself was not well executed. Ukrainians, I think, would say, well, how could we have executed that when the line is so heavily mined and we didn't have air power and you weren't willing to give us air power? And I think both sides are kind of right.
John.
So it strikes me that much of Eric's commentary is we gave a huge magnitude of munitions or material or whatever, and Nastia's response is, well, it's not commensurate with the need. And those are both true.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's maybe the fundamental dichotomy between the perspectives here.
So I want to pose an additional fundamental dichotomy and ask Tyler to talk about it a little bit as well, because I think one of the, we don't tend to talk about it very much, but one of the fundamental dichotomies is the relative marginal concern about nuclear war.
Yes.
So if you are the United States, I think Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, likes to summarize US policy by saying, support Ukraine, defeat Russia, don't blow up the world. Right, that's the two prongs of policy. And the difference between the war going nuclear and the war not going nuclear from a US perspective is, first of all, existential for the US, and B, it's binary. It either happens or it doesn't. There's very little marginal. But if you're Ukrainian and you've already had Chernobyl, right? So there's already a high degree of ambient, you already have an ongoing genocide. I have never heard a Ukrainian express nuclear anxiety that is routine among American policymakers, and the marginal difference between being killed by conventional means and being killed by nuclear means is much smaller than the marginal difference between not being killed and having the world blow up. And I think it makes just an enormous difference to people's relative risk psychology. So Tyler, as the person here who has had to listen over and over again to Nastia saying, why don't you guys just be willing to blow up the world? Speak about your reaction to that when, Nastia's enthusiasm for us pushing and pushing and pushing.
Right. I mean, it's one of the reasons we named the show Escalation in the first place. But I mean, you spoke of a lack of persistent nuclear anxiety, but I even found it went further. There's almost this flirtation or gallows humor around it.
I've heard people say, actually, a close friend of mine said that she actually would be happy if Russia used a tactical nuke in Ukraine, because then she thinks that then the Americans would finally actually get involved properly and fight on our behalf.
I mean, and another example of this
You've heard it too.
Was
it's the thing.
Yeah, one of the Ukrainian cultural forces, is a singer named Sasha Boul, I think is his name, and he sang this American country style song about nuclear winter and how great it's in Ukrainian.
He's the only Ukrainian language country western singer.
And I mean, I was kind of clutching my pearls during this song, because I I didn't live through the Cold War, so I don't have those anxieties, but I still think it would be a very bad thing if the nuclear taboo was broken and we came to blows with Russia using nuclear weapons. I mean, I understand the Ukrainian perspective that, why does our world is being blown up? Why does it matter like how it's blown up if one can help us? But it is I think a very genuinely understandable and justified existential fear.
But it is also an area where Ukrainians genuinely do not understand US doctrine.
So I was gonna, push back against both of you.
I mean, and look, I'm not saying our doctrine has nothing to do with their reality. It wasn't created for them. It in fact doesn't protect them. But it is, from a from a US perspective, our nuclear doctrine is really successful, right? We outlasted the Soviet Union. We didn't blow up the world. Sorry, you say war and world a lot of times in the same talk, and they really begin to blur together. We didn't blow up the world. And by the way, we didn't have a major land war in Europe until now. It's a really successful thing in terms of US management of Russia and the Soviet Union. You try to explain that to a Ukrainian.
It never works.
It's
It
like
never
not
works.
a persuasive argument.
No, well, I think so. Mainly it's because Ukrainians are convinced that Putin will never do it and he's just bluffing and all of this is nuclear bluff. And also, to be fair, I don't think this is necessarily like a all American versus all Ukrainian discussion. I think there is a portion of American policymakers and Americans in intelligence community who also think that the threat of nuclear escalation is very much like lower than what the Biden administration thought it would be. And I've heard people talk about that before. Like there are policymakers and experts in the US who also think that, Putin is just bluffing and he would never do it.
Sure, but the higher up they are and the closer to the nuclear chain of command they are, the more
cautious
that
they
does
are.
tend to concentrate the
I
mind.
mean,
But
that
Biden is a Cold War.
And that's very important. Yes.
He's even older than I am, my God. And I remember the Cold War vividly. I even remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the whole idea of a nuclear war is not just tactical military weapons.
No, it's a very real
blowing at
thing.
this one, blowing at this one. It's the whole world going on.
Yeah.
It's everything and everybody.
Yeah.
This is, at one point, there were enough nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia that there would have been nothing left alive except cockroaches.
Yeah.
I think the really important psychological component of that even Ukrainians who've never self-consciously thought about the issue intuit is that the whole construct assumes that Russia gets Ukraine, right? Because during the period in which, as Tyler says on the show, I didn't have a sense of Ukraine growing up. There was just this big red map that was called the Soviet Union. And, in the period in which we defended the world and ourselves using nuclear deterrence, Ukraine was already gone. It wasn't designed to defend Ukraine. It actually wasn't designed to defend any frontline state except West Germany. And we set it up
In opposition to Ukraine.
on the assumption that Ukraine was on the other side of the line. And so if they feel unprotected by that, it's kind of because they're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So turning back to the concept of Tyler and Nastya having different reactions to things.
Clearly.
Just before we walked into the room, the headline was Putin backs U.S. ceasefire idea for Ukraine, but says the details need to be worked out. And I'm kind of wondering what the differential reaction is. Maybe Tyler first.
Well, that's news to me, literally. No, I guess I'm not surprised by it. I mean, we were just talking about on the way over here when we were walking over whether or not Putin would accept the terms. Yeah, I guess it's a similar dynamic.
Do
We're
you think you
leaving.
might accept them?
Do you-
you accept
Do you read that headline as saying yes or saying no?
Exactly.
But also, like, what, okay, but everyone accepts a ceasefire, 30 days go by, and then what? Right, like, the positions of US and Ukraine are completely, entirely incompatible, correct me if I'm wrong.
US and Ukraine.
No, sorry,
Russia.
Russia and Ukraine,
Yeah, definitely.
sorry, Freudian slip, Russia and Ukraine. Which you now can argue that, you know, which side America is on. But yeah, like the positions of Ukrainians and Russians on this are completely incompatible. And what Russia is demanding is something that, like, the Ukrainian society, not only like Zelensky and his circle, but the Ukrainian society would never agree to. Like, you know, I can totally see like Ukrainians marching on the streets if the government had ever accepted most of those demands. So, you know, so that's my point. Like, this ceasefire thing is, I see it as a just like something that it's just a card to play for Trump, for his domestic audience. Like, hey, look, I stopped the bloodshed. People are not shooting anymore. People aren't dying anymore. You know, but 30 days go by, and then what?
The striking thing about, and I haven't read the underlying story, the striking thing about that headline is that it doesn't just say this is the second half of it, right? Which is, you know, Putin accepts, but rejects. And until you see a headline that says that stops after Putin accepts the U.S. Ukrainian framework, which is itself pretty disadvantageous from a Ukrainian point of view. I would be very skeptical that that's anything more than a public relations stunt. But what do you think, Eric?
I mean, this is somewhat predictable reaction, I think, by Putin, which is, you know, try to look constructive, but stall, and try to create conditionality. I would actually argue that the sort of unconditional ceasefire proposal that the US and Ukraine put on the table after Jeddah was the maximally advantageous deal that Ukraine can get given the present circumstances. And, you know, if we get to a position where there is an unconditional ceasefire, again, with some amount of monitoring and verification, that's best case scenario for Ukraine in the current environment.
Yeah, I guess my assumption that it's disadvantageous is that the current circumstances are themselves disadvantageous.
Yeah, but it's not only, you know, the political dynamic in Washington, it's the military balance over the past couple of years, it's manpower challenges on the Ukrainian side, it's, you know, the impenetrability of the Russian defenses, so on and so forth.
So we have 3 minutes left, and I just want to ask you each, what should episode 7 be? How does this story end?
Me first?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, like you said, it's the story is not going to end anytime soon. And I think even if we get to this sort of place where the Russians accept the terms of some sort of ceasefire that is acceptable to Ukraine, the underlying reasons for this war, you know, which is about Russian imperial attitudes towards Ukraine that haven't shifted, those aren't going away. And so you're still going to have an underlying confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, and by extension, the West, which has, at least the Europeans at present, have embraced Ukraine as part of their family. And so the story isn't going to end this year, even if there is a ceasefire. And I think there will be, you know, many more chapters to this. I guess my hope is that if you pair the urgency with which Trump is trying to seek some sort of end of the war, and you get a bit of pragmatic and long-term thinking about how not to just get the guns to fall silent for a day, but to actually put in place some bigger frameworks for managing this competition and this rivalry, which is now inherent in Eastern Europe and going to persist for generations, then you could end up with a solution that's actually okay for the time being. It's not going to solve everything, but it's okay. And there's a chance that, you know, Ukrainians can return to somewhat of normal life in a completely different political framework in which security is the top focus, going forward, and they understand that they're going to be living in a very difficult environment, and ultimately, at the end of the day, can only count on themselves and their own army and their own industry. But I think you might be able to get there, but it requires not only the declaratory statements by Trump about this needs to end. It's real hard diplomacy, getting in the room, refusing Russian, capitulatory demands and trying to come up with some sort of framework that's a reasonable ceasefire.
Nastya?
It's going to be very important for me in the last episode to highlight and kind of like look back at the entire project and the entire history, and highlight that Ukrainians and Americans just have such a different, again, history with Russia, and they're looking at the situation from different points of view, both of which are valid. Which I know I've been kind of playing the role of you're a Native American, I'm an aggressive Ukrainian, but I don't actually very often I'm not actually like that. But I very often talk to you and say Ukrainians just don't get this, because I think I'm in the best possible position because I'm a Ukrainian, but I work with Americans every day, so I get to hear both sides like every single day, and so I think we need to highlight that Americans aren't just stupid to be scared of nuclear war. Nor are the Ukrainians just stupid for wanting to win against an aggressor who they perceive as has been trying to eradicate them for literally hundreds of years, quite literally. And so how you square those realities, I don't know. I'm too young to know, or I don't know if anyone knows. But I think just reflecting that, neither side is stupid or doesn't know. Like both sides just come from very, very different points that are valid.
Tyler, you got the last word.
Yeah, the end point of the story, which is not an end point, as Eric pointed out so well, it has been a moving target for so long, and I'm kind of glad we waited because I feel like a perfect scene in my view to end on would be the Oval Office meeting recently between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. It does seem like if we take more of the continuity narrative rather than the break narrative, it just seems like the culmination, the acceleration of this dynamic, just the worst possible version of it, all coming to a head in the Oval Office. And, we kept joking that Russia's the third wheel and we're trying to just make a show on U.S. and Ukrainian terms, but, Putin's not in the room in the Oval Office, but he's in the room.
He is.
Yeah.
Yet he is.
And so I just think it's a tragic ending. It's not a happy ending, but it's I think would be the truest to this narrative that we're telling.
We're going to leave it there.